Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Amy Spurling, founder and CEO of Compt. Compt is an HR software company that enables companies to offer truly personalized employee perks while being fully tax compliant and inclusive for global teams. Amy, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only because of your career and what your experience has been, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in terms of your career in finance and what you've seen kind of in markets. And I won't spoil it too much, but we'll obviously dive into what you've gone through in terms of not only the past, but how is it relevant today, but also this whole interesting industry around HR where companies are really trying to shift their model from what I've seen at least, and I'd love for you to share, into investing more in their employees, whether it's rewards, whether it's stipends and different kind of benefits, because I think they see the value in keeping people long-term. And I'm curious on which new and creative ways they're starting to do that. But before we get into Compt and what you're working on now, what were you doing before you started the company?
So I've been in tech for, a long time, over 20 years. I've landed in it coming out of business school and have spent all of my time in finance and HR roles. So mostly managing finance and HR, so CFO, COO type roles. So spending a long time growing, scaling companies, raising money for companies, spending a lot of time in VC offices and figuring that out. So I spent a lot of time just kind of in and around the tech space.
Yeah, and when one thing I always think about with a lot of founders, they talk about move fast and break things. Don't really kind of care for the intricacies of intricacies of like operations, fundamentals. I'm curious in your experience, how has that kind of philosophy or ideology kind of gone to bite the founder in the butt as they kind of grow and scale? And what are some ways founders can kind of preemptively prepare themselves so that they don't have to do a lot of back work?
It depends on philosophy, right? I do not like to go fast and break things. I want to go fast, but I don't want things to break. So it's a measured growth from my perspective. And it depends on what you're building. Like if you take a very measured approach at building like a generative AI company right now, you're going to get smoked in the market. You have to move fast and just figure things out on the fly. So there's a lot of nuance in answering that. But, the CFO in me does not like a lack of compliance. And so my companies, they started out at a certain size and I kept going earlier and earlier to figure out where there was no more mess for me to clean up.
Yeah.
And then suddenly I was standing in a room by myself and I was like, all right, this is what we're going to do. So I like from day one here, client compliance and kind of building for scale has been our backbone. So in my opinion, it helps you scale more quickly when you put in the right process at the right time.
Yeah.
But if you haven't done it before, then it's also like that's a lot of heavy lift when you really need to go and build things.
Yeah. And is it dependent on the type of product? Like if you're, say, a healthcare tech company and there's a lot of HIPAA and compliance there and building very strategically, like what industries would you say need to rely heavy on building those processes early versus others who, can kind of afford to do it later on?
Right. Anytime you're dealing with compliance, you've got to be very careful about how you build. We're in the compensation space. If we were not very, very thoughtful in what we released and when, people don't get paid correctly. And if people don't get paid correctly, you are breaking the law. And so you can't afford to mess with that. Same like you mentioned, healthcare, HIPAA compliance, like you cannot mess with people's private data. You have to think about things like that. Whereas if you're something like a chat bot, or some sort of like a generative tool to help sales perform better. There's a lot less regulation compliance that you need to focus on than it's just build and ship and figure things out as they break and fix them.
Yeah. And I always wonder, when is the right time to bring in like a CFO or a fractional CFO while you're building a company? Is it when you're preparing for your next round of funding? Is it in the kind of genesis of your product? Once you've got your MVP, you've got some adoption in the market, now you're looking to build another version, you're bringing on more people. When is the right time for founders to really considering how to not only identify their operating model, but also how and where they can expand and invest more resources?
I think it depends on the skill set of the founder. Like, do they know, are they comfortable with building a financial model to show that this is a business? So it's not just a cool thing I want to build, but it's people will want to buy it. Here's how we think about the market. Like, are they able to do that? If they can do that, that's the early days. It's really, there's not that many bills you're paying. There's not many financials you need to close. Like, you're not as worried about that.
Sure.
So you don't need to hire somebody if you can do that. If you don't know how to do that and it's, I want to build this really cool thing and I think people will want it, you probably want to get somebody to help you think through the modeling. That doesn't mean a full-time hire though, by any stretch. You can do fractional work, things like that to help somebody think about it. Where I usually got brought in as CFO was usually after the first big round. So depending on the year it was called, anything from a seed to an A to a B, like all the numbers mean the same thing over time. And it would be a board appointed position where it's like, hey, this group just raised $10 million. Make sure they don't spend it in 3 months. And so then we'd start building and growing for scale. And it's really looking at, all right, what processes are in place? How do we deploy this capital? Looking at that financial modeling and the projections and things like that.
What are some of the common ways you see founders deploying capital? And is it in hiring? Is it in technology? Is it in microservices? And what in particular do you see them kind of really investing in the dollars? Is it product, people, customer acquisition? What is in particular?
It depends on the stage. I mean, when you are just starting out, it's there's a lot of really cool tools out there that can help you get going where you don't have to hire headcount, which is great. Think about there was a day and a time when CRMs were done by hand. The fact that CRMs are a thing is amazing.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of tools. So early on, it's going to be tools to help you move faster. Yeah. Then you start adding headcount. Typically in a tech company, anywhere from 70% to 80% of your costs are usually around your people. So it's a pretty sizable chunk of what you're spending on. And then over time, it may end up being bigger marketing budgets, things like that for customer acquisition. But that's not until much later when you've got product market fit and are really able to say, all right, $1 in equals $5 of sales.
Yeah. And what trends do you see, being that you've had such a lengthy experience with startups and seeing the different ways that they've scaled and grown, what have you seen change in terms of whether it's hiring benefits, when I'm bringing on employees, how's the ecosystem change? Especially also now VC dollars are becoming a little bit more scarce and less investing, I think, in eyeballs and consumers and users and more so investing in profitable, scalable businesses with product market fit, with all these processes in place. I feel like VCs are kind of turning into private equity in a lot of ways.
It's funny. It does feel like that.
Right? Yeah. But what trends are you seeing when you deploy that capital into hiring people that is just different than when we were seeing? Obviously, remote work is one thing to consider and all these other things. But what have you seen that's significantly different and how have it impacted the startups?
So, I mean, 15 plus years ago, it was all about negotiating your salary. So every candidate, it was like every process was a process of one. Because nobody knew, it's just, what do you want? And it's a dance to figure out what you're going to pay for somebody. Because there was no transparency about what roles were. Nobody was comparing across. There wasn't even a way to compare your salary. If you were a product manager in one company versus another, until you got somebody on the phone to find out what they were paying, you had no idea. That's totally different now, which is kind of mind boggling, right? Now, if I want to know what a product manager makes at a certain type of company, you can find it out in a couple of seconds.
Right.
And so there's a lot of consistency in pay scale across different roles, different sizes and stages of companies, which is great. I think that, and with the pay transparency laws, that means that people go into it with a lot more power. Candidates go into it with a lot more power, which hopefully shrinks that wage gap a lot more. But that means that it's not a tool for companies to compete against each other anymore either. So they have to think about it differently.
Right.
So you've got health insurance, especially in tech. Table stakes. People expect a competitive salary. They expect health insurance. So it's, all right, if the company needs to hire more people or retain the people they have, how are they going to stay competitive? How are they against whatever their competitive set is? I'm not competing against Amazon.
Yeah.
Yes, my team could all go to Amazon and make a lot more money. They're not going to. That's not, they want something different. And so it's competing against your competitive set of companies. And so that's where companies have gotten into personalization. How do we take a step back? Employee perks went crazy for a long time, and it was a perk for everything and an app for everything. And you could get banana stuff out there.
Yeah.
People saw low utilization of that stuff. They cut it in a down market. Now we're getting to a point of, all right, how do you do personalization? Every person wants something different. How do you do that at scale? How do you do that to where people are actually happy? How do you do that on a budget? Budgets are not unlimited. And that's where we're seeing this movement towards that personalization concept.
Yeah. And just to give the audience more context, describe kind of the genesis or the inspiration, the light bulb moment for Compt. And what in particular were you seeing in your experience where you needed to really tackle the problem that you were seeing? Was it lack of transparency benefits? Was it standardization of it? Was it companies looking for ways to actually impact their employees? What in particular did you see that made you so confident in working on something that's going to be touching a lot of, I think, a lot of different important undervalued aspects of a company, which are what employees get out of that relationship.
Yeah, for me, it was just an extreme and mounting degree of frustration that drove me to this point. Because there were two sides to this, right? I'm an employee in all these companies, myself, and I'm seeing all this money going to compensation because we were trying to compete. So you're offering all these different perks and benefits, and most of it didn't relate to me. There was some great stuff, but it just didn't relate to my life. And so I'm like, well, that kind of sucks. Like, why is that person getting so much more compensation through these benefits that I don't have access to because it's not something relevant to me? I don't have a dog. I don't need pet insurance. I don't have kids. I don't need fertility benefits. So I'm like, it's not that stuff's not good and relevant, but it doesn't apply to my life. And so on the employee side, I was frustrated. And so were all the employees in all of my companies. And then on the administrator side, this was back when there were offices. I had an office where it was felt like a revolving door of people saying the same thing that I was feeling. I don't want that. Why can't I have something else? Why can't we do this other benefit? I saw this cool thing online. It's just get out. I can't manage that. There's no way we can just keep adding things for people. We don't have an infinite budget. So I talked to engineering friends. I'm like, can't you just go build a thing? I'm sure it's not that hard. Just build me a thing. And everybody's like, no.
Yeah.
But talking to other HR leaders and finance folks, we were all having the same issue. And so finally I hit the point where it was like, look, this is a really important component of compensation. And it's also a way to make sure that we can support diverse teams across all demographics. So it's not just a racial or ethnic or gender diversity. It can be an age range. I'm sitting in a different part of my life than you are, for instance.
Yeah.
We need and want different things. That's okay and should be expected. How do we support that? But how do I also do it in a compliant way and sticking with a budget and all of that? It's this has to exist and nobody's building it because you really have to understand both finance and HR to understand the compliance angle of what you got to build. And so I turned 40 and said, heck with it. I'm going to go build the thing.
I love that. And also thinking about in the building process on what the limitations were at the time, because I'm assuming that a lot of times things aren't built because there's a lot to consider and there's a lot to incorporate and there's a big knowledge gap. And seeing that you come from a world where you have that knowledge, so the knowledge gap's out of there. But in thinking about what are the limitations for companies to actually add benefits, I'm curious as a founder myself. Is it restricted on geo? Is it restricted on income level? Is it restricted on all other things that I will end up finding out later on in the compliance process? And I've invested all this time and now I don't even want to go through that again. What are the limitations for employers that you've kind of had to work through and even, I don't know if Compt has a solution for that, but even solve?
Well, so part of it, there is geographical stuff you got to think about, especially when you're thinking about tax compliance. So we did find that a lot of companies, and COVID accelerated this, started having employees in other countries very early in their life cycle. When I started my career, all of my prior companies have had some international component, multiple countries. But they were way later. You have product market fit, and then you're like, okay, and now we're going to launch in the UK or in China. That's not the way things work anymore. It's, hey, I've got employees everywhere. That's where they're working. So it's less of a go-to-market and much more of a, this is where my staff is.
Yeah.
So we saw that earlier. You start having a lot of localization. You got to figure out early on, how are you making employees in all these different countries feel like part of the same company? Hey, we support your wellness, but not telling them, hey, we support your wellness, but it's only with Planet Fitness. And you got somebody in India going, thanks, amazing benefit doesn't relate to me. Thanks so much. Right. So making sure that your team feels that level of personalization and support. Yeah. And then the tax piece of it, because in some countries, some of this is taxed, in some it's not. In the US, there's different things that are taxed or not. And as an employer, you're never going to know that, to be blunt. Tax code is not fun. You don't know payroll tax codes. Quite frankly, I don't know payroll tax codes. When I'm figuring out, okay, I'm setting it up in ADP and my people are in this state and that state. ADP calculates that for me because it's changing all the time.
Yeah.
When you look at this part of compensation, it's making sure you know what needs to be taxed and what doesn't. That's where we automate that. Because otherwise, you start handing things to people, you may as well give them a bag of cash under the table. Yeah. Very illegal, by the way. Don't do that. But that's essentially what companies have done for a long time, and now they're in trouble with the IRS.
Yeah. And thinking about, obviously, I'm curious about kind of domestic and how policy it affects certain labor and labor laws and things like that. But sticking on the topic of offshore or even near shore, right? Even if it's,
Right.
south of the border from us, which I run a company that we connect engineers from South America to startups in the US. And a lot of questions we have is around those benefits. And if I'm an employer, we offer PTO in the States, but how can we do that
Right.
across country? We have a way that we've solved that kind of a roundabout way, but also
Yep.
we've suggested other things around stipends and things like that. But if I'm somebody who
Yep.
wants to hire, build a team out, what are the different things I can consider if I do want to give somebody extra benefits, like a stipend, like equity? Can I do that?
Right.
And how can I do that without getting in trouble?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that it depends on the size and scope. If you're hiring one person in another country, are you technically compliant? Probably not. But is the government in either country going to find you? Probably not. It's a risk analysis,
Sure.
right? When I would go into other countries, you're weighing that. Am I going to set up a whole legal entity because I've got one employee in a country? Probably not.
Yeah.
The other way to manage that is to go through a third party. I've done that many, many times where it's like, hey, I've had engineers in Costa Rica and Argentina and the Ukraine. I'm not directly hiring them because then you're getting into money transfers and cross-border stuff and yuck. Using a third party that is the gate who is dealing with that, fantastic. Then the question is, how do I make these people feel like they're part of my team? To your point of like PTO and all of that. If they're actually your employees, like, one, don't just assume the U.S. is the standard and everybody gets what the U.S. has. You're going to make such a mess. Like, look at maternity leave, for instance.
Yeah.
If you try and apply our absolutely horrific maternity leave policy to the rest of the world, you're not going to hire a lot of people. Like, our parental leave policies are like awful here.
Right.
And so you have to think about what is required in other countries. And that's where a third party can be really good to think about that. So there's great companies out there, obviously, that do that, like you folks as well, to help you be able to scale quickly in other countries.
Yeah. Well, in regards to like taxes in particular, like if I do offer a stipend as a placeholder for another benefit, what are some things for the founders out there? What's the form I need to file to make sure that all of that is accounted for? Typically, a lot of companies will 1099 people, and so that the employees will have to deal with their own kind of local tax laws. At least that's how a lot of our clients do it. But the stipend component is a little bit of a gray area because it can kind of fall under income, but it can kind of fall under a benefit tree.
Definitely falls under income.
Okay.
Let's be clear. It kind of definitely falls under income. Like, there's not really a lot of gray area.
Yeah.
The way stipends work is definitely So it's not that there's necessarily a form. It's the same. If you're 1099ing people and you're hiring people in other countries as contractors, then it's the same from a tax perspective as if you were paying them an extra whatever dollars. So there's a lot of, they can add it to their invoice that they send you every month. So it is taxable income to them, and then you're paying that fee. The bigger question is, should they be 1099s? Are you still complying with local tax law when you're hiring these people as 1099s? And I mean, because different countries have different rules of what a contractor actually is. And that's where third parties can be very helpful in kind of navigating and managing that.
Yeah. Sticking on the subject of just like, obviously I want to get on local in the domestic hiring, but in terms of distributing benefits and not just because every country doesn't just have dollars to dollars, right? It's pesos, at least in Argentina and in other places. Or a lot of companies are kind of thinking about involving cryptocurrency. And so how has that kind of been? How have you kind of tackled the nuances of that industry? Nuances is, I think it's getting bucketed as a certain category under what we already know, but there's still some of there's different mechanics in tracking the exchange of
there
currency.
Definitely are.
Yeah. Have you been able to kind of go along with that change? Do you see a lot of companies offering those benefits?
So what we see, like most companies that we work with, like all the companies we work with have a U.S. presence. About 30% of them have people in other countries as well, and may have a lot of other countries. I think one of our customers has like 30 other countries. So people can be really scattered.
Yeah.
That was part of what we wanted to build here, was to allow companies to say, hey, for instance, we support your wellness, but in the U.S. you get $100. In the UK, maybe it's 75 pounds. In India, it's however many rupee. In Argentina, it's a different number. It's not necessarily all pegged to the US dollar. It can be a different amount because cost of living can be different, and companies are doing localization. And depending on the countries, it could be vastly different. So allowing for that local currency and that local payroll is really, really important. And so that's something that we built in and automated here, partly because it just didn't exist. Like even payroll systems, there is no one payroll system that you can use that can manage all of your countries. That is mind-boggling to me in this day and age. Like, how have these big behemoth payroll systems that are decent platforms, why is it that I have to use 10 different systems for 10 different countries? It's so frustrating as an employer.
Is it a knowledge gap, do you think? Just with every country being slightly
tax
different?
country.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so much tax. Like there isn't a single accounting firm that knows global tax compliance. Like no one does that. It's just not a thing. So the services haven't caught up with the way we do business. Like a lot of companies are truly global. That's just not a thing yet. So I'm hoping this next evolution of, I don't know, companies of knowledge of all the things gets us to a place where you do have global accounting firms, global payroll systems where like, look, yes, my people are everywhere. They're in all kinds of countries and that's okay. And I can pay taxes in those countries and that's fine and do all the things that are doing it right. But give me what I need to be able to do that accurately. Because right now it's really difficult to do.
Yeah. Do you think it becomes more or less complicated? And what I mean by complicated is I define complicated as having to be very specific about certain situations and categorize them accurately amongst those situations, especially like I'm a sole proprietor and there's just a lot of things I have to consider.
Like even the nomenclature is different. You've got like GmbH legal entities in Germany versus an LLC in the US versus like, been a while since I've done China, but they've got another one. Like everybody has their own different classifications and may have 3 or 4 in a country and they don't all line up cleanly. Like this is very complicated stuff, which is where I typically use third parties to help navigate that when I start going and putting people internationally, because it's complicated stuff. Because they don't always line up. In different countries, you've got different compulsory benefits. So things you have to offer people. A lot of countries, you're getting health insurance. Like you're paying taxes as an employer, but employees are not paying for health insurance like they do in the US. So then you're looking at, all right, well, fine, I've got Canadians, they're getting health insurance, I'm paying into the system, but how do I make that seem fair when I'm paying, like when Americans are having to pay for health insurance? How do I think about compensation in these two countries? Like, it's very complicated.
Shifting gears and thinking about domestic, there's obviously been a lot of changes in labor laws in certain states, and even including another sector of labor that wasn't necessarily prevalent for a while, introducing child labor kind of practices and things like that. How has that those policy changes affected Compt in particular? And what are companies asking you when those changes come about in terms of what's the opportunity there? What's the benefits? How do I stay compliant? What are the changes you're seeing? How are those all those policy changes really affecting your company? And what are some things companies are asking you that they haven't asked before?
Sure. So one, I don't see companies that want to do child labor being like, woohoo, compliance. Like, let's get little Tommy to work. Like, we're not seeing a lot of that happening. Like, yikes on the child labor, not a big fan. What we do see and where we do see an impact on this is particularly with out-of-state care. So with the reversal of Roe, with the fact that a lot of people lost access to basic human health care, especially in our southern states, where they can't get IVF, they can't get treated. If they are pregnant, they can't get the treatment they need, much less if they don't want to be pregnant, which is also a right of a human being to not be forced to carry another human being. We see a lot of companies trying to address this and make sure that they're supporting their team members. And this is where there's been this huge rise of out-of-state care stipends where employers are like, look, if you need to go to another state and get health care, where you can go through our health insurance, because some states still, of course, like California is a great state, they're still going to be covering the health insurance. Massachusetts is another one, we cover it. And so even if you're in another state, you got access. But if your insurance is in Texas, you probably don't have access to the healthcare you need. You may need to leave the state to go get the healthcare you need. A lot of companies are setting up stipends to help employees navigate that. And that's been something where we've seen a huge shift and a huge movement. And it's great to see that employers are saying, look, we're going to stand by what's right and we're going to stand by our employees. Like there's a lot of nonsense that's happening out there, but healthcare is a basic human right and we're going to stand up for that.
Are employers worried about repercussions for offering those stipends? I know people are, just in terms of helping others get resources, but Yeah, if they're worried, what are some
Yep.
things that they can kind of alleviate in terms of their worry on that particular backlash?
I mean, there is always that risk, right? The laws, the way they're written, are very far-reaching, overreaching. If you were the Uber driver who drove a woman to a clinic to get an abortion in Texas, in theory, her cousin could sue you.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
craziness, right? Like, none of this makes any sense. So there's always going to be risk with these stipends. What we do is we work with companies to navigate and remove as much of that risk as possible. So you're not creating an abortion stipend. You're creating an out-of-state care stipend where
yeah,
any employee on your team can go to another state to get health care. So Compt, for example, we're in Massachusetts, where our team is in 12 different states. Some of them are in those exact states. Well, I do have an employee who's in New Hampshire. If one of his children got really sick, he'd probably come to Boston. We've
yeah,
got world-class hospitals, and he's in a rural community. We could still use that stipend.
yeah,
So there's ways to do this where you're covering your entire team without getting super hyper specific and prescriptive to try and make sure that everyone has access to coverage and just giving you a little bit more opacity
yeah,
as you're dealing and navigating with some completely draconian state
yeah.
laws.
Yeah. Yeah. But shifting gears and thinking about Comp, what's particularly been excited about your growth up to this point? How many companies are you working with? What have been some really exciting kind of case studies or stories that you've heard in terms of the benefits that your companies are giving your employees and the success of that? And also what's next on the agenda? What's next in the next stage of growth? So talk about the traction up till now and
Sure.
kind of the future.
It's been a pretty wild ride. And so we got very much accelerated with the complete push to remote as companies were trying to navigate that. So that was a huge growth push for us for the last 2-3 years, where companies were like, oh, shoot, nobody's in the office. We still have to figure out how to compete. What are we going to do? Stipends is the way to do it to where we can do this personalization. So that's been a big tailwind for us. What's been really interesting now that everybody's kind of going back to normal, and there is more of a push to go back to offices, for better or worse, in my opinion, is that we're seeing movement in other industries. And that's been really exciting. You've got the coastal tech companies who put the slide in the office and started with foosball and did all the wild and crazy perks, right? But you didn't have like manufacturing and construction and
Yeah.
hospitals going, woohoo, let's put a slide in.
Mm.
That's not a thing. Now we're seeing where these more nascent industries are sitting there going, okay, we're struggling to retain employees and be competitive. There's a huge labor shortage in this country
Mm.
across industries. Our unemployment is sitting at less than 3% right now, I believe,
Yeah.
maybe about 3.5%. There's virtually no unemployment, and this is across industries. So people are trying to figure out, all right, I got to retain people, I got to hire people. I don't want to make the mess that I've seen other people do, but how do I compete? And how do I do this in a way that really supports my demographic,
Yeah.
my people in a way that's relevant to us? And
Yeah.
that's where personalization becomes really key. And that's been really cool to see, where you can see this movement where companies are now saying, hey, yeah, I do want to support wellness. And it's not just a smoking cessation seminar like in
Sure.
the 1980s.
Yeah.
It's that a recognition that if you do work in manufacturing or you are a nurse on the floor, but you also care about your wellness,
Yeah.
but maybe you want to drive it in a way that matters to you. Maybe it's running shoes, maybe it's yoga, maybe it's a mental health app.
Yeah.
Maybe but letting the employee be empowered to do that in their own way. It's been really cool to see the personalization angle.
Yeah. Whether it's externally or internally, what are some of the biggest risks that your company faces today?
I mean, external risk, I guess. I mean, does the bottom completely fall out of the market? Does
Yeah.
anybody know? Like, are banks going to exist tomorrow? Like those types of things, right? The big existential crisis.
Yeah.
I don't think any of that's going to happen, by the way. But that's something that is always a risk. I was a CFO in 2008. I got to go through that delightful little downturn, recession, and figure out how to navigate it. This one's very different, but it's figuring out how you navigate that. You have to be very agile in this moment. For instance, if our entire customer base was just small tech companies in San Francisco, we would be in a lot of trouble. Like that is a group that is probably not getting their next round of funding. They're struggling with where money's going to come from. They're doing layoffs. They're not spending money on people because they're like, shoot, yeah, maybe we aren't competitive, but we got to keep the lights on.
Yeah.
If that was our whole customer base, that would be a huge risk. It's not.
Yeah.
Like we're diversified across 17 different industries. And so that gives us a lot of ability to figure out, all right, which one is moving fastest right now? And how do we focus on that while tech kind of gets its stuff back together? Because it's going to come back. This is a little blip in time of like, shoot, what's going on? And then we're going to go right back to building things.
Yeah. If everything goes well, what's the long-term vision for Compt?
In the long term, it's our ability to support people is people everywhere, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, what I want to see is that employees get access to all of their compensation, that companies are building more diverse teams and able to support them. And I want to see lots of companies being able to do that, not just tech companies. This is a way and a path to do that. So the more reach.
Yeah.
Like that's what's really exciting to me is just keep building and growing and supporting more and more and more people.
Yeah.
And then working with our partners to make sure that happens. And so keep getting bigger.
Yeah. I love this next section. I call my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we get.
Okay. All right.
I always like to open up with a softball. What's particularly hard about your your job day to day?
My job day to day, honestly, like the hardest part is I do get hit with migraines, and navigating that can be a real, like, it just is a frustrating time suck. So the hardest thing for me isn't even actually anything about our job. It's just managing migraines.
Yeah. What in particular, are you yes or no to the blue light glasses craze? Yes or no to that? Being that it actually affects you, I'm assuming more drastically than the average.
It's different. So I don't have light sensitivity and I don't get like nauseous. So none of that has any impact on me. It's a totally different kind of headache ball game. So I'm a yes, probably for some people, but it ain't helping me.
Yeah. What's something that you're good at now as a founder that you wish you were better at earlier on?
Ooh, probably sales.
Yeah.
So coming from a CFO background, I really didn't think that I would ever be doing sales. And then I realized, but I'm the buyer and I know what I like. And so you just reverse the table.
Sure.
If I had had more confidence than that earlier and recognized that, I think that would have served us very well here.
Yeah. In that kind of experiences, that growth and maturity was asking better questions, whether it's just taking the swings and figuring out the ecosystem you're dealing with. What in particular kind of helped you navigate or grow through that?
It was more of just self-confidence, honestly.
Yeah.
I knew the questions that needed to be asked because I buy this stuff. Like that was my job in all my prior companies. So it was recognizing like, no, I actually do understand how to work with people just like me and figuring out like, all right, we need to support them different. There hasn't been really a book written on selling to HR. There probably should be. Maybe I'll write it. Like it's a different type of buying situation and you need to treat them with respect as part of that. And it's just a different buying cycle. So recognizing that, was realizing, okay, I'm not going to find it in a book. I actually need to trust myself a little bit here.
Yeah. One question I thought about in preparation for this is what's one or two maybe benefits that companies should be offering now that you see most companies not offering, and how do they offer them?
I think it's more the how than the what. Okay. So a lot of companies are trying to offer wellness to their team, which I'm all in on. Like it makes sense from an employer perspective. If my people are healthier, they're going to get more work done. Makes sense from an employee perspective. Like this place where I spend 8 to 10 hours a day should probably be contributing to my wellness and not taking away from my wellness. But it's the how that's delivered that I think is changing. Companies for a long time have been acting like a parent and saying, oh, you want wellness. Here is a thing that you may or may not want. And there's kind of a change in that happening, recognition that, yes, we want to support your wellness, but you're an adult. And what you need for wellness is probably different from me.
Yeah. What's one way that you say, being that there's a lot of HR software out there, managing different parts of I would say, the employee life cycle, what makes your company different? If you were to just give me a 30-second kind of pitch on what in particular are you tackling that you see just a lot of other companies missing on?
So employee personalization, which drives the outcome of employees using their benefits. Normal employee perks, 3 to 5% of the team uses it. With Compt, for 4 straight years, it's been 91% utilization. Like you can't beat us in the market. So it's making sure you're getting to those outcomes and driving to that rather than focusing on, I've got a catalog of stuff nobody uses.
Yeah. Do you measure its effect on employee retention? Are you able to get that data from your clients? Oh, if you are, what is that?
Yeah.
Exciting about it.
So some of you can, some of you can't. There's a lot of, I mean, we're not the only factor, obviously, in employee retention. When the market goes south, doesn't matter what you're doing on stipends, you're going to do layoffs. It just is the reality. Well, we have found, we had a recent survey where almost 70% of people said that they were more likely to stay at their employer because they offered them stipends. Like that's really, really significant, where employees are looking at all the things that are going to keep them there. And the stipend is a big key piece to what's keeping them happy.
Yeah. Now, how do you thinking about, I think HR software for a lot of us don't see it as something that needs to be replaced or nice to have or something like that. But those who see the pain or feel the pain day to day obviously have a different opinion. How do you cut through the noise to get to that person, that champion, or that individual who was you in a different company? How are you able to cut through the noise to be able to actually attract their attention and get them to kind of see the value in it in a tough market that we're in, where companies are just pretty much just like, I don't want to buy anything new if it's not broken, don't touch it. But seeing that there's a deeper problem, more of a long-term problem, how are you able to get through to that person?
So getting through to them honestly isn't that hard. If a company has trouble hiring people or retaining people, they have to take a different approach. And now they have less money to do it. There isn't a more efficient way to spend your money than on a stipend when you're getting really high utilization. You can go spend a bunch of money on a bunch of things nobody's using. That seems pretty dumb. Or you can spend a little bit of money and reach everyone. So you cut through that. And the qualifier is like, look, if you're not hiring anybody and you're like good on retention, you literally don't need to spend more money. Don't. But if you have to solve for that, it's how are you going to solve for it and how are you going to do that in the most efficient way possible? That's where we come in.
Yeah. I always like to ask this next question because I love how founders extract knowledge out of anything that they ingest, whether it's early in your career or now. What books or people have impacted or influenced you the most?
So most recent book that has had like a kind of been sticking and rolling around the back of my brain is it's called How the Future Works. So it was written by Sheila Subramanian from Slack Future Forum. I think that the research that they did was absolutely incredible and groundbreaking, and just looking at how companies are looking at, all right, what does flexibility mean as we move into this next phase? And that book, I think, is absolutely groundbreaking.
Yeah. Any people that you really kind of impacted you in a positive way, or you, as a mentor, or anyone in particular that gave you some lesson and you kind of used it, and what in particular was that?
And there's been lessons from literally every person I've ever worked with, right? So it's not like the days of, I know like with a lot of those mentor protege things, it's like, who is the person who guided your career?
Yeah.
I don't know that that's really a thing. Like maybe it was at some point. I don't know maybe it isn't for women as much. There's always plenty of offers to mentor you, but it's a different situation. To me, it's what do you learn from each person that you interact with? And so it's everything from my first boss when I was like 21 years old. She seemed old. She was 27 at the time, and I thought she was ancient, which is hilarious. She really guided me, even in that role, was like, look, you're doing some good stuff, but I was in a marketing role there at that company. But I was also taking on a lot of really menial tasks that weren't my job. And she's like, look, just because you could vacuum the floor doesn't mean you should vacuum the floor. You need to understand what value you bring to the table and focus on that rather than picking up all this other stuff just because you're being the helper. Like you're not going to help your career doing that. And that's something that is stuck in the back of my brain for forever because she's right. And it's something that women in particular tend to do in organizations. They don't raise their hand for like the big projects. They want to be the helper. Back in the day, it was who got coffee, all of that stuff. And that just shoves you into this menial role when you have so much more to offer.
Yeah. And just for other female founders, even individuals who are in other organizations, in other industries, are there any groups or any area? For me, being Latino, I listen to a lot of Latino content, thinking about Latinx and tech and things like that. So that's been very helpful for me to kind of adjust. But anything in particular for women that you've found exceptionally helpful, a group, a knowledge syndicate, I don't know in particular, but is there anywhere that you think a lot of people you've enjoyed kind of the community around women founders and things like that?
I usually go micro. So I'm an introvert by nature. I'm not you put me in a big room with a lot of people. And if I'm on stage, I'm happy as a clam. But if I'm in the audience and supposed to be talking to everybody, completely overwhelmed and can't manage that. It doesn't work. So for me, it's micro. So I don't even know how many different Slack groups that are 4 or 5 people, 4 or 5 female founders, or just founders in general. Yeah. And that to me is how I actually get more of that community piece, because that's how it speaks to my soul. I need to get to know individuals on a little bit deeper level. So I think there's more than one way to tackle this versus there's obviously lots of podcasts and stuff like that. I spend less time there and more on getting into the weeds with a couple of people at a time.
Yeah. I love that. Last little bit is I always like to make sure, I know we're coming to the close of the show, and I do want to give you a chance to give us your plugs and your Twitters and all that. But before we do all that, is there any question that I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that we didn't talk about that I should have? Want to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table. Is there anything I didn't ask you?
I don't think so. I think you asked them just about everything.
I love that. Well, Amy, it's been such a pleasure. Last little thing is, where can we find you? Where can we support you? Where can we not only be fans of you, but also the company? Give us your LinkedIn's, your websites, everything we need to be a part of it.
Sure. So we're Compt HQ on Twitter, compt.io online. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Amy Spurling. Same with Twitter as well. I'm signed up in 2008, so I actually got my name. Very happy about that. Didn't use it for like 5 years, but I'm happy I got my name on Twitter, at least for a while, right? Yeah. Or people can reach out to me at amy@compt.io as well if they want to chat.
Amazing. Amy, it's been such a pleasure learning about your early career. What brought you to Compt? What Compt really is doing, not only for employees, but for employers, wanting to keep people, and really kind of, I think the big focus, like you mentioned it earlier, is there's a labor shortage, but you want to retain the people that you have. You want to retain the good employees. And a lot of that is just what you offer them, and can they actually use that and affect their lives. And it's amazing to see what Compt's been able to do up to this point. And I'm excited to see where you grow from here. So I hope you enjoyed yourself, but thank you again for being on Behind Company Lines today.
Thank you so much.
Of course.